Hello everyone, today I want to come back once again on early medieval Christianity and more specifically looking at this phase of transition in the religious sensibility and in general the Christian and as well as pagan religious culture in Europe. This is I've dedicated already several videos to the late antique world, how the Christianization of the Roman Empire, how how after all every time in history is a phase of transition, how there is never a moment in which things are idling, and even though we can identify definitely a times into which changes maybe are more or less rapid, times into which there is maybe a kind of dogmatism that makes things remaining at least up to a certain point into this ordered frame, and definitely the early Middle Ages are a very fascinating moment, because from one side we have a bit of the deceleration of great religious changes, because the same society was less synetically in moving. Essentially, it had less energies. The plague had struck. The demographics had contracted. So the world was capable of less force in itself, but at the same time, exactly for this reason, the changes that occurred were the base, the new base for what would have developed in the future, and definitely this phase of transition really gave, in many ways, a genetic character to the major, to the following developments in European society at the time. So today we're gonna talk essentially about maybe a later stage of this, not really the early Middle Ages as the very beginning of the Middle Ages, but the early medieval history, especially during Carolingian and Post-Carolingian times. Once again, you will say, well, yes, but it's a bit more theoretical in itself. And it takes into consideration phenomena that occurred also in the previous centuries, as well as in the late antique world. But this has to do, well, let's really go into the core of it. We can say that in many ways Christian culture was diversified according to the various societies that it met. Definitely, that they met it from different conditions, like the Roman Empire had known it essentially in this rise of Christianity as a sort of illegal sect that eventually was accepted by the statal power, and eventually in 1 month basically became the excuse me, not in 1 month, in 1 century. It was really thinking about else, the religion of state. There were other societies like the Germanic ones that basically Christianized as a political move, and from a condition of political dominance, in the sense that they were ruling over places that required their Christianization as a clever move for being able to roll over there. And also in here, demographic aspects had their own importance, in the sense that the Germans were really a few compared to the places where they settled in southern and western Europe, so that they began to eventually abandon the paganism that they still retained, even if maybe their elites were already Christianized and mixed with sometimes a Christianized society, but still retained heavy and solid substratum of paganism itself. So the syncretism that emerges from these phases what really strikes me the most, because these were societies that were basically forced to get together for good, because it was the only way that they could survive, they could do something in practice. And these were societies that basically at the end of the early Middle Ages were practically indistinguishably blended together and fully syncretized, in fact. So at the end of the ancient age and the early Middle Ages, especially in the very first centuries of the early Middle Ages, it was the ecclesiastical hierarchy that carried out essentially the Christianization of the rural environments. This took place as together, telling the truth, with the backing of the secular power, which at this point, whether it was Latin, whether it was Germanic, it was usually both at this point. It saw the extension of Christianism as essentially the extension of the same ecclesiastical structures into which lay aristocracy participated, being at that point also in there intermingling with, in the sense that we have this dichotomy of the ecclesiastical hierarchies of senatorial origin from one side, and the warrior hierarchies of the Germanic origin from another. Well, these came to mix as well, and they came to eventually share one character, one of the other. The ancient ecclesiastical tradition, being of senatorial origin, was essentially an urban class, a literate class, and also a civilly skilled one, because they were literate, they wrote, they were very highly cultured people. The Germans were fighters instead, and powerful rulers of clans, and the outcome of the blending between the two was essentially, and you can find it in especially Gaul is probably the brightest example, but it also happened in Spain to many and to a greater extent into all Latin Germanic Europe. Basically, bishops came to be a bit more ignorant, but a bit more powerful, militarily speaking, with their own retinues, and they began to expand also as lords in practice. Not that before they were something extremely different, but they also became to have a more I can't say a more secular life, because they kind of had always had that, so at that point, but it kind of became much more aristocratic, much more mundane in many lifestyles. You know, going hunting, carrying weapons, having an armored retinue, and all. And the interesting thing is that the rural environment at this point was still largely pagan, as we've seen, as Christianity had spread mostly in the cities, and had remained there largely even in early medieval times. Therefore, the Christianization of these communities was proceeding in a formal and organized way. that could, in this sense, export even the rule of the urban aristocracies, or at least of those that were maybe at that time trying to expand into newly conquered territories, like the Germanic ones. But there was an obstacle into this path, in the sense that the local rural communities weren't very happy to be Christianized, or better. This is also maybe a myth. This is an approximation. Surely there was resistance to Christianization in many cases. Sometimes it was also a violent one. But most of the times it wasn't really related to religious problems themselves, but they were in fact related to the political problems, the political implications that they entailed. I mean, the dioceses, for instance, was finding a new diocese, maybe into a formerly pagan territory, equated sometimes to see superimposed the power of a secular Christian ruler that therefore wanted to expand in there. And in this sense, the church became, this was extremely clear, for instance, in the Carolingian conquest of Saxony, a sort of an eye of royal rule in terms of political and not just religious loyalty of the local populations towards the empire. Because at that point, resuming paganism from the subjugated Saxons did not equate to a problem of belief of what people really had in their mind, but it equated to take arms once again against the Franks. And this is very important, and I want to stress this because objectively we see that even in the formerly fully Christianized lands, the actual knowledge about the Christian teaching was abysmal. If you look at the Frankish clergy before the Carolingian reforms, well, these were evidently people who couldn't even read Latin. They prayed with formulas and expressions that were completely invented and misliterated, mistranslated, and sometimes it's even ridiculous what they were kind of expressing. And you understand that at that point, the ecclesiastical institution in certain lands, especially north of the Alps, was something just formally accepted as a system that in this sense could produce economic interests, indeed, because as we were saying, the church had its own properties, its own structures, its own power. So since the wind was in favor of the expansion of Christianity at one point, but probably was something convenient even, from just a social perspective in terms of organization and all, that it was just important, yes, to place a cross on an altar and to pretend to be Christian, to just say, okay, we're Christian, point. Is it enough? And people didn't study much at all, and the clergy was extremely ignorant about the same Christian scriptures. And if this happened on, in especially at the highest levels of the clergy, you can imagine what the situation was among the rural populations, who obviously couldn't read. They had a form of, let's say, a treasure of beliefs that really you can't really erase from one to another, and that Christianity practically never did, and could have never achieved, indeed. That obviously were still pagan beliefs, that however were so strongly rooted because they were functional to that rural life, to those natural cycles related to agriculture that were so you know they were there from literally from millennia, and therefore you couldn't really take them away as nothing from these communities. And after all, and this is a problem the church basically never had before the rebirth of the year 1000 and the following centuries, is that these peoples, not being aware of Christian scriptures, in the sense that they never read that, they maybe heard them being read from people who, as we have seen in turn, were also probably quite unaware of their real meaning and contents themselves, that they simply didn't care. I mean, there was no potential for like heresies or a development of unorthodox thoughts. What really mattered at that time from a church perspective was to tie the ecclesiastical structure to the statal one, to the secular one, to cooperate, really, because the church at that point was really being turning out pretty useful for secular aristocracies, as we have seen, and we can say that in a certain sense they both legitimated each other. So it was like an agreement, it was like a pact, and then if there was no other major problem in this sense, why bothering with that? From a doctrinal point of view, I'm talking. Because, telling the truth, in the Eastern Christianity, heresies had been there. They had been there for a very different nature of the Eastern society. Like the Byzantine Empire had a completely different approach and to the church, and I mean not really to the church as such, but really especially the relation between the secular power and the church. And sometimes the secular power had, in the person of the emperor, had misused the church from a Christian point of view, in the sense that it had exercised his power in order to back sometimes certain heresies, in order to in turn appease or having kind of better relations with those very wealthy fertile areas of northern Africa and the Near East that provided grain for Constantinople, and that would have rebelled otherwise. So we're no one to criticize in this sense, but it's still interesting to see that in the meanwhile the Western world that was still in very strong and continuous contact with the Eastern one. If you take the papacy, it was, you know, they always cooperated with Constantinople up to a certain point, but at the same time were very actually very doctrinally orthodox in front of these weird heterodox adventures of the Byzantines, and I must say that even the Germanic society that had been Christianized from relatively a few, they followed the moral authority of the popes in backing it against the what was happening in the East. And even if you take the Longobards, were deemed to have retained paganism from a longer time, or also other Germanic peoples, even more in the north, were actually quite orthodox. They didn't give rise to problems, and if anything, if they were Arians, they did nothing but eventually passing to Catholicism fully, and there was simply no potential for heresies to spread, because this would have been a completely opposed logics to the one that was following secular power towards the church at that time, and no other stratum of the population was so educated, so literate to even approach the Christian scriptures eventually to create heretical thoughts. So in this sense, the major heresies in the West came from areas that were from a time into which the intellectual vitality of the Hellenistic culture was still present. If you take Donatism in North Africa, or Pelagianism that came actually from Ireland, from Pelagius, I mean, were out there in relatively early times, and they had been substantially they had, I can't say died out, but there was no reason to resume them at that point. This is also very interesting because at this point the Church of Rome didn't have any control on other churches in practice, if not in Italy, and therefore in other areas, like especially Spain, there was even sometimes different traditions that were taking place, different local liturgies. For instance, the Spanish one, the Visigothic one, was very advanced. They kind of could have, if Spain had not been conquered by the Arabs, it might have even been a valid concurrent to Rome, because the Visigoths were the Visigothic Church better, because the Visigothic secular power in that sense had been basically choked by the same church. I made a video about the councils of Toledo. If you want to know more about that, just search for that in Medieval Christianity playlist. But this for saying that the horizons were quite different, and even though there had not been a sort of full systematization of even of the thoughts of the fathers of the church. I mean, if you take Saint Augustine said Saint Augustine was a genius and an extremely intelligent person, but he definitely said things that were quite borderline. And that really has to do with not just with his non-Christian background that he originally owned, but also and especially for the power, for the high spirituality and an inner tension that he had that was expressed with great vitality and very powerful thoughts and concepts that, however, had not been fully accepted, or at least not formally accepted by other churches at that time. So eventually, what happened in the Low Middle Ages and also in the following centuries and up to the Reformation and all, was in a certain sense the waking up of Europe again from this, from early medieval times, into which in fact this kind of speculation basically ceased. And resuming thoughts and ideas and problems that had not been settled definitely since the early Christian times. So it's not surprising that that Augustine had such a great impact on Luther, among the other things. But just for saying that all this relative heterogeneity of beliefs and of different local traditions had not caused during early medieval times the rise of heresies, because simply there was the lack of an intellectual humus to develop into, for them to develop into. But with the rurals, the Christianization of the rurals, what happened was essentially the acceptance of a ritual Christianity, we can say, into which the ancient practices and even the same places of culture of the various polytheistic traditions were basically substituted or transformed, even though they still influence in turn the new faith, and with their inspirational motives. And this really happened at every level of society, at every level of life, in the sense that you have to think of beliefs, especially in the rural world, that was still, here we said polytheistic, but sometimes it hadn't even developed as a fully polytheistic religion, at least in the narrow sense of the world. This certain these peoples had maybe still sort of animistic beliefs rather than strictly polytheistic ones with a pantheon and all. And yet for these people, we can say that the more primitive religion is, and the more it's related to every aspect of life. Like, these people believed that every accident that happens in everyday life came from the external in some way, that rituals and practices could basically avoid such things to happen. And since let's say that the lifestyle of these people was pretty harsh but yet pretty simple, it didn't present particular variations, or you have to think of this terrible surviving economy of survival in practice. The Christian teachings had really to accompany these people into everyday life. So the relation with Christianity had to be pervasive to eventually win over these communities to the Christianism. And this happened in many ways. Greatly important, especially in the Christianization of the countryside, were the monks rather than the bishops and their priests. This happened too through, monasticism was really a different mind from the from a different mindset from bishops. Were also positive in some ways, and maybe also in competition, even though not really usually it was the papacy that tended to, because papacy, the popes of Rome were technically bishops like just all the others. So the popes of Rome were really those who backed monasticism and its spread, because in this sense it could help could help the Roman Church to rise in prestige over the other bishoprics and their political influence. You have to think that bishops in this sense were ferociously involved into political matters here, and even in contrast with each other. So monasticism was the one that kind of retained more ties with Rome than bishoprics, than dioceses, and that in this sense dialogued with Rome a lot. And fortunately, from a historical point of view, we have a lot of sources about this, about the actual Christianization of the pagans. So that the Pope from Rome literally wrote what these monastic missionaries had to act like with the local communities, because it was very important to win them over. This happened. In the West, it was a quite delicate and progressive and an intelligent work, but from one side, from another side was also the competition with Constantinople, winning over, for instance, the Slavic populations to either Constantinople or Rome. So they were quite highly difficult tasks to carry out, and they had definitely to impact with societies that, I don't know, sometimes we picture as kind of passive towards the Christianization, but that in turn had interests on their own, especially their elites and aristocracies to convert to Christianity, because that could be a very valid tool to acquire more power into their communities, and therefore, you know, from the same church to eventually have a sort of influence on the same societies through the aristocracies. And in this process, Christianity kind of lost part of its heterodoxy, in the sense that obviously in the local councils that existed there, you have to think that the ecumenic councils had started into Christianity with this idea that the Christian world was in fact an ecumene, I believe in Greek it is, that is the universe. So ecumenic council means literally that every single bishop from Christianity had to participate in a way or another. Then eventually with the end of the late antique world and beginning of the early medieval one, the councils had become smaller, more based in the local dimension. Like, I don't know, there would be councils in Gaul, into Spain, and all. So more rarely in other at long range. Obviously, if a great council was carried out in I don't know, in the Byzantine Empire, surely there were Italian bishops there, because there would have been a direct interest into those matters, but just ideally speaking, everybody could participate. But in these councils, highly theological and doctrinal thoughts were debated. Sometimes in a rougher way than in a less sophisticated or refined way than in the late antique culture, where bishops on average were more educated, but still very important ones, and still based on the fathers of the church, on what had been said, and naturally obviously on the scriptures, but also through what had been deliberated by other councils. And this tells you how the single councils could be politically addressed in certain decisions. But that was the field of doctrinal debate. When those who had to do instead the harsh job of Christianizing pagans, sometimes they had to invent things that were they had really to invent sometimes ways to let these people believe in practice what they wanted, what the Christian teaching really was. And there were points of contacts even through paganism, in the sense that if you take thaumaturgy, that was something that existed into Christian culture since, it's in the Bible. It's for instance, the holy anointing that gave this thaumaturgical powers was something that you find in the Judaic tradition as well. Well, this seemingly existed also into the Germanic tradition, the pagan one, for certain kings. So what the Christians said is, okay, let's keep these people believe that their kings, if holy, are capable of thaumaturgy. And in this sense, let's say, okay, yeah, because also Christianity accepts that. So in this sense, there was not even an actual change into the actual belief. I mean, probably the Christians said, oh yes, okay, you have these powers because God gave it to you, my dear king. And the king might have smiled, like saying, if he wasn't in condition to be conquered by certain Christian powers, he said, okay, well, maybe it is so, and therefore for maintaining good relations with these missionaries, and maybe the people would start believe that maybe together with the older forces of their traditional pagan world, maybe the Christian one was even backing the tradition that they already had, so they saw it as a positive thing and maybe growing more familiar with it and accepting it more easily. And there is also for instance in popular Christianism the rise of certain rites carried out by priests whose prayers were done towards the divinity, but together with that to a following of other figures that were maybe semi-divine, like angels or saints that the faithful felt as powers with a certain with a certain power on a certain power of their own, figures with a certain power of their own, and that in this sense could be really put next to God as maybe the relics of those ancient deities that these pagans already retained, and that made Christianity in this sense a bit more flexible in perspective. And these angels and saints sometimes we know were definitely figures readapted in Christian fashion that instead existed from a pagan, from a religious pagan background. It is pretty well known that many saints that are celebrated by according depending on the church are actually invented, historically speaking, that they were created basically on the base of certain local traditions that sometimes we can't even track anymore in practice and to know what they really were, of maybe of figures, even of warriors, of terrible fighters. If you think about the Irish world, pagan world, what it was really made up of all these deities that really came from the souls of the ancient warlords that were buried, and their graves would be sort of place of prayer with an inspiration for those who wanted to go there and ask for an advice and all, that eventually were maybe Christianized, and they would become saints. So from people that were originally praised into a warlike fashion for having maybe slaughtered hundreds of people as warriors, a saint would emerge. And in this sense, the role of military saints doesn't have to be underestimated. Actually, military saints were extremely popular in this time, and not just in this time, also in the low and late Middle Ages, and they remained so, simply because they had been appreciated by, I don't know, the Germanic populations that had arrived, that maybe they were formally Christian like Aryans, but they still retained their warlike ethics, and they appreciated, I don't know, the Saint Michael Archangel as, you know, as killing, as punishing with his swords the enemies of the faith, and really concentrating their mindset on the sword rather than any other Christian thinking, and therefore exalting them as Saint Michael in this sense was very highly praised by the Longobards, It was a figure was famous all over Europe in this fashion. The Byzantines had a lot of military saints, and it is interesting in this sense that most of these military saints were actually, according to our geography, become saints because they had been martyrized for having refused themselves to shed blood. And instead, into popular culture, these military saints became actual military, actual warriors that were those who wanted to shed blood for the protection of the faith. And the local communities needed these beliefs because these were quite highly violent times into which warfare was present. There was a few centralized authority, so there was a lot of instability, and the chances that things could go wrong. So these figures that could that were believed to be actual military defenders of the communities were seen as a comfort by the local populations, and and this is why, by the way, the saints remained so important in so many cultures at the limits even of idolatry. In certain cultures, I mean, paganism and contractualism really remained sometimes at the basis of certain beliefs in the most primitive areas of Europe, and still in relatively developed societies there are these kind of schismatic beliefs remaining, with the idea that the saint can make you a grace or something like that. Because it's really paganism that has never died out behind this, beyond these things, beyond Christianity, and in its true meaning, that is the idea that you have to accept actually all what God decides, and not to think to overcome problems by asking, a little help, a little personal help. Very unchristian in many ways. And this process went along definitely with the spread of relics, of icons. The relics in this sense were thought to have definitely magic powers, that even the contact with them or their presence were conceived as a sort of source of force to be defended from occult forces and all. Relatively to icons, I made a video about the origins of Byzantine iconoclasm. In there, I'm explaining a bit how the relation with icons worked in this sense, and how iconoclasm really had many different causes, seemingly. But it is indeed true that certain communities, especially in the peripheries of the Byzantine Empire, were using icons, especially where there was, because in the Byzantine Empire, theoretically everything was ruled by the state. There were no lordships and all. But the state couldn't be always everywhere, and also because it costed a lot of money, a lot of resources, and that was definitely what was lacking in the early Middle Ages. So sometimes those who remained in certain peripheral areas, especially in the countryside, where was the church, certain very powerful monasteries. So basically, these centers were starting to expand their influence and their autonomization from Constantinople through the popular beliefs that were channeled through these symbols in the icons that were kind of believed to be, I don't know, even more powerful than to be actually powerful in the first place, and therefore having a certain intrinsic value in them. And as I was saying, even if the causes for iconoclasms were varied. This was definitely one, and idolatry was definitely one of the accusations that the Byzantines made against this practice, even though sometimes it wasn't true. It was just the Byzantines who wanted to sack the rich monasteries and their properties in this sense by accusing them to practice idolatry through the icons. So it really depends on the situation and the single case. And relatively to this, there is also the spread of pilgrimage as a Christian practice, especially these pilgrimages were very sometimes on very long routes, and they had as an arrival point certain holy places of great fame, like, I don't know if you're taking Gaul, San Martin of Tours, or also in Italy, the basilicas that in Rome kept the sepulchres of the martyrs. But also, I was talking about before the figure of Saint Michael. There was a very famous sanctuary in Apulia, the Monte Gargano. There was, by the way, a very ancient pagan sanctuary that eventually was converted into where a monastery eventually was, upon which a monastery was eventually founded. So all places that had a certain spiritual past in many ways. Churches sometimes were built over the ancient acropolis of cities where the sanctuaries of pagan gods had been erected. So all of these happening. In Monte Gargano was a very famous sanctuary that had been erected, in fact, to the archangel Michael Archangel, and but these pilgrimages could lead already in the early Middle Ages directly to the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem. Especially when the early Middle Ages were coming to an end, so towards the 10th or 11th century, there were all new stopping points, let's say, with various or differentiated arrivals that really began to develop very international, usually very international pilgrim routes, like Mont Saint-Michel on the Channel. That was Mont Saint-Michel was actually twinned with the Saint Michael in Apulia, and that's where the name. And there was a very strong relation between these two communities. So from northern France to southern Italy, the monks regularly kind of interacted. Also, monks usually traveled sometimes. They weren't really all enclosed into their monastery walls. They moved for these pilgrimages, for sharing manuscripts, for carrying out diplomatic missions. So they also needed these forms of logistical support, simply that the monastic net could provide. Or just think about Saint Michael, San Michele della Chiusa in Piedmont, in northwestern Italy, that really came at the opening of the Francigena Way, that was in this sense passing through the Susa Valley into the Po plan. or also Santiago of Compostela in Galicia in Spain. So a lot of places that eventually developed these huge pilgrimage routes. Here we named just the most important, that eventually gained this great importance in an increasing importance in low medieval history and beyond, and around which gravitated a lot of different communities. Just think, I don't know, about the hostels, about the tolls, or that were present in the stopping points for the pilgrims and all. These were routes that were definitely also taken by goods, by trains. There were think about all the civilization that passed through these paths. So just for saying that this was all put in motion by religious belief, but also by the practical, pragmatic reasons that existed behind, we can say, Christianization itself, not as a purely religious ideal, but as something that was really fitting for that world, in terms of for comforting fear, for this sense, kind of making cooperate society, secular power, ecclesiastical power, that put in motion a lot of patrimonial strategies that were evident, especially when in post-Carolingian times the monasteries were increasingly becoming private foundations of the great families of the aristocracy. So all many reasons that eventually contributed to develop what we see still today in what has remained of materially of the medieval world, in terms of art, of architecture, of many other aspects, and still parts of our beliefs, in the sense that if you really go look in Europe into local traditions, especially in the countryside and all, you find that there are still beliefs that are dated back to those times, and that in this sense are still now they're dying out, sadly, but in part they still answer to certain needs, to certain to part of those same needs that existed in the Middle Ages, and that are so dearly kept by these communities. So here it is. I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like or just subscribe to my channel. And as always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. It's really important. I see that there are certain people who are really watching my videos at this time. I don't know how entertaining they find them, because they are sometimes, I don't have a very energetic tone of voice, but I still care that at least what I say is meaningful, and I hope that they follow me for this reason, and therefore I thank them very much once again. And as always, I wish you a nice time, and see you next time. Bye.